Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere that smells interesting. Somewhere full of marble, sandals, and too many men in short skirts pretending they invented everything. Welcome to ancient Rome, a city that conquered the known world and somehow also managed to turn urine into an actual taxable commodity. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe grab some grapes or a cup of something not too alcoholic. Because tonight, we're diving into the strangest jobs that actually existed in ancient Rome, from people paid to cry in funerals to those whose daily routine involved, well, collecting other people's pee. Yeah, Rome was impressive, but it was also deeply weird. Let's drift back 2,000 years to a city that never slept, mostly because there was always someone shouting "fresh fish" at dawn and someone else emptying a chamber pot at midnight. The city that ran on sweat, slaves, and secrets. Rome, at its peak, had over 1 million residents. That's 1 million humans packed into crumbling tenement blocks, smelly alleyways, and endless noise. The elite lived on hills with views. Everyone else lived above taverns or next to public latrines. Now, when you have that many people, you also have a lot of needs. Food, water, sanitation, and let's be honest, ways to keep all that mess somewhat under control. And so, Rome developed a labor ecosystem that was incredibly advanced and incredibly bizarre. See, not everyone could be a senator or a legionnaire or a toga model on the Appian Way. Most Romans had jobs that were decidedly less glamorous. And while the history books love talking about emperors and generals, I think it's much more fun to imagine the poor guy whose entire career revolved around washing other people's tunics in fermented human urine. Let's meet him. The fuller, Rome's smelliest profession. If you lived in ancient Rome and owned clothes made of wool, and everyone did, you had to wash them. But Roman laundry wasn't a cozy domestic thing with soap bubbles and scented detergent. It was an industrial nightmare involving fullers, enormous vats, and the city's other greatest export, pee. Fullers were basically Roman dry cleaners. Their job was to take dirty tunics, soak them in a mixture of water and ammonia, which they got from fermented urine, and then stomp on them with their bare feet until the stains came out. Yes, they stomped, like winemakers, except instead of grapes, they had other people's excretions. Imagine the scene. A large open courtyard with rows of tubs, men rhythmically squishing fabric underfoot while the sharp tang of ammonia stings your nostrils. It's like an ancient spa, if that spa was built over a sewer. Now, where did they get all that urine? Good question. Because the Romans had a system for everything, including pee. The urine collectors, aka Fuller's best friends. Enter one of Rome's strangest professions, the urine collector, officially known as the curator urinae. These were the men who went around town collecting public urine from pots placed on street corners. Yes, public urine pots were real. They were like the ancient equivalent of recycling bins, except what you were recycling was your bladder output. Once collected, the urine would be sold to the fullers, who relied on it for cleaning. And in classic Roman fashion, Emperor Vespasian decided to tax it. Yes, in the 1st century CE, Rome literally had a urine tax. It was called the Vectigal urinae. Vespasian's reasoning was simple. If people are making money from pee, the state deserves a cut. When his son Titus mocked him for taxing such a disgusting substance, Vespasian famously held up a coin and said, "Money doesn't stink," or in Latin, pecunia non olet, which frankly is the most Roman thing anyone has ever said. So to recap, you could be paid to collect other people's urine, the emperor would tax you for the privilege, and the end product would be used to wash aristocrats' white togas. Rome was built on marble and ammonia. The Street of the Fullers. Archaeologists have actually found fullers' workshops all over Roman cities. Pompeii has some of the best examples.
You can still see the shallow vats, the drains, even the murals advertising their services. One fresco shows a man pouring liquid into a tub with another man stomping beside it. And the slogan? Something like, "Your clothes will shine brighter than Jupiter's lightning bolt." That's confidence. But fullers weren't just washers, they were also funishers. They brushed, bleached, and pressed garments with sulfur vapors to get that crisp Roman look. So yes, the man walking proudly through the forum in his spotless toga probably had no idea how many gallons of fermented urine went into maintaining that pure image. Kind of poetic, really. Now, let's move from the smell of ammonia to something equally strange: the sound of grief. Because in Rome, sadness was also a profession. If someone died, especially someone with social status, you didn't just quietly bury them. Oh no, you hired an entourage of mourners to wail loudly and dramatically through the streets. They were called praeficae, and they were usually women, middle-aged, experienced, and with a flair for performance. Their job was to wail, tear at their hair, beat their chests, and shout how amazing the deceased had been. All for a few coins. Think of them as the ancient world's emotional influencers. They didn't know the dead person personally, but they sure made it sound like they did. The theater of mourning. A typical Roman funeral procession could look and sound like chaos. Imagine a crowd snaking through narrow streets, musicians playing flutes, slaves carrying torches, and professional mourners wailing like they'd just lost their own family. The louder and longer the crying, the more respectable the deceased seemed. We even have ancient authors mocking it. Seneca, for example, couldn't stand the practice. He wrote that mourners rent the air with fake lamentation and shed tears for pay. Cicero was even more blunt. He called them noisy hypocrites. But despite the mockery, the profession thrived. Why? Because Romans loved spectacle. Death, like everything else, had to be seen and heard. And of course, the richer you were, the more mourners you hired. Emperors could have entire corps of crying women.
And of course, the richer you were, the more mourners you hired. Emperors could have entire choirs of crying women. Commoners might afford just one particularly talented screamer. If you think modern celebrity funerals are over the top, Rome did it first and louder. Goosekeepers and sacred birds. Let's float over to something a little gentler. You've probably heard of the sacred geese of Juno, right? If not, buckle up, because even the geese in Rome had jobs. The Temple of Juno on the Capitoline Hill kept a flock of sacred geese. Their job? To guard the temple. And apparently, they were very good at it. According to legend, during a Gallic invasion in 390 BCE, the geese's honking alerted the Romans to an enemy night attack. The human guards had fallen asleep, but the geese saved the city. From that point on, they were treated as holy animals. They lived comfortably, were fed daily, and even had their own attendants, the anserari, or goosekeepers. Now, you might be wondering, was that really a full-time job? Yes. Yes, it was. And because Rome was Rome, those attendants probably earned less than the geese's food budget. The anserari had to feed, clean, and guard the sacred flock, and woe betide anyone who harmed one. Killing a temple goose could get you executed. Meanwhile, the geese themselves got annual festivals in their honor. Imagine telling your family, "Yeah, I look after the divine birds, the ones that scream at strangers." It's a living. Side note, sacred chickens. While we're on the topic of holy birds, Rome also had sacred chickens. Because
Why have one ridiculous tradition when you can have two? These chickens belonged to the augurs, priests who interpreted the will of the gods. Before important battles or political events, they'd perform the ritual of the Polarius. Basically, they'd release the chickens and watch how they ate grain. If the birds ate greedily, good omen. If they refused, bad omen. And yes, major military campaigns were literally decided by whether some chickens were in the mood for breakfast. Once, during the First Punic War, a naval commander threw the sacred chickens overboard when they wouldn't eat, saying, "If they won't eat, let them drink." He promptly lost the battle. Because, Roman superstition had a sense of humor. So, if you're keeping score, that's 2 bird-based professions so far: goosekeeper and chicken auger assistant, both with better job security than the average Roman laborer. Now, while goosekeepers enjoyed divine favor, another group had the opposite reputation: the carnifex, or executioners. These men handled Rome's dirty work: torture, executions, and punishments. And while the job was necessary, it was also deeply shameful. Executioners were considered untouchables. They lived outside the city walls, weren't allowed to enter temples, and could never hold public office. Basically, Rome used them, feared them, and pretended they didn't exist. Their job included everything from beheading criminals to whipping slaves and branding thieves. And yes, the same person who executed prisoners might also clean the city's public toilets at night. Rome loved efficiency. The irony, of course, is that while emperors like Nero or Caligula ordered endless executions, the man who carried them out was the one socially despised. Because morality, in Rome, was always about appearances. Bread makers, bakers, and burnouts. Let's move to something softer. Literally. Bread. Romans adored bread. It was the backbone of their diet. And the pastores, or bakers, were crucial. Baking in Rome was hard labor. You had to wake before dawn, grind grain on heavy stone mills, knead dough by hand, and bake loaves in massive clay ovens. Flour dust everywhere, constant heat, and absolutely no concept of modern hygiene. But bakers had status. Kind of. They were part of the essential trades that fed the city. Some even got rich supplying the army or the state granaries. Others were slaves who spent their lives turning wheat into crusty sustenance for people who'd never learned their names. And because everything in Rome had a god, yes, there was one for baking too. Forculus, protector of doors and ovens. You can imagine a baker whispering a prayer before lighting the fire, hoping not to burn an entire batch and lose a week's wages. A city of strange professions. So, by now you can see how Rome wasn't just emperors, philosophers, and gladiators. It was a living, breathing organism made of thousands of obscure professions. From the guy collecting your pee, to the woman crying at your funeral, to the man baking your daily loaf. Each job weirdly essential. Each one a reminder that history isn't just about heroes. It's about the people keeping society's plumbing, laundry, and sacred poultry in working order. As night falls over the ancient city, you can imagine the sounds. Sandals scraping down cobblestones, a mourner practicing her cries, the faint hiss of bread ovens cooling, and somewhere, a man with a bucket full of urine heading off to make a living. Because in Rome, someone always had to. The bestiaries, Rome's human animal handlers. If you were having a bad day in Rome, here's a comforting thought. At least you weren't a bestiaris, one of the men paid to fight wild animals in the arena. Now, before you picture a glamorous gladiator flexing heroically in front of cheering crowds, remember, the bestiaries were not celebrities. They were mostly prisoners, slaves, or desperate volunteers. And their job wasn't to win. It was simply to die interestingly. Picture it. The Colosseum at dawn, the crowd roaring, the emperor waving lazily from his seat, and some poor soul in the sand clutching a short spear, staring at a lion who has not eaten in 3 days.
The audience loved this kind of thing, because of course they did. The Romans turned death into entertainment the way we turn it into documentaries. A bestiarius might fight boars, leopards, crocodiles, or sometimes even giraffes, though those matches tended to end quickly and awkwardly. But there was one upside. A few of them did survive. A lucky few gained fame and could earn enough to buy their freedom. The rest, well, their bones probably became part of the Colosseum's underfloor compost. It's grim, but weirdly poetic. Rome loved grandeur, even in horror. And somewhere between the sand and the blood, someone had to clean up. The arena cleaners. Yes, there were people whose job it was to clean the Colosseum after a day of slaughter. Imagine hundreds of animals, thousands of spectators, spilled drinks, and, let's just say, occasional human leftovers. The arenari handled it. They scraped the blood-soaked sand, refilled the surface, repaired props, and reset the stage for the next performance. No one wrote poems about them, but without them, Rome's favorite pastime would have smelled even worse than it already did. And because Rome couldn't resist bureaucratic order, there were sand inspectors too. People whose job was literally to check if the arena sand was the correct texture for maximum absorbency. Somewhere out there, a Roman civil servant was proudly filling out his tablet. Sand consistency, acceptable. The perfume testers. Now, after all that sweat, blood, and animal musk, let's change scent. Let's move to something fragrant. Perfume in Rome wasn't just luxury, it was obsession. They had oils for hair, oils for bodies, oils for statues, oils for dogs. Some perfumes cost more than a small farm. And of course, someone had to test all those scents before they reached the emperor's delicate nostrils. Enter the unguentari, or perfume workers. They were chemists, part artist, part lab rat. Their job was to mix exotic ingredients like myrrh, cinnamon, rose petals, and even crushed shells into fragrant oils. Then they'd test them on slaves or assistants to check for reaction and longevity. Imagine spending your day rubbing perfume into people's arms while trying not to sneeze from the powdered iris root. And yes, sometimes the mixtures went wrong. Roman perfumes could be powerful. Pliny the Elder once wrote that a man fainted after standing too close to a perfumed lady. Whether that was from the scent or her personality, history doesn't say. The testers worked long hours in steamy workshops, surrounded by burning incense, trying to create something divine. Meanwhile, the emperors they served often smelled like they'd bathed in a flower shop.
Nero, in particular, was infamous for dousing everything, even his banquet halls, in rose water. Because when you're emperor, moderation is for peasants. Let's float back outside under the Roman sun, which was, apparently, merciless, especially if you were rich and wearing 10 layers of toga. Wealthy Romans often hired someone whose sole job was to carry a parasol for them. These attendants were called umbracalifer, literally shade bearers. Yes, that was an actual profession. Their task was simple: walk slightly behind your master, angle the umbrella correctly, and make sure their perfect patrician forehead never met direct sunlight. Mess up your shadow alignment, and you might be whipped. But that wasn't the strangest servant job in Roman households. Some families also had nomenclators, personal memory assistants. The nomenclator, human social media reminder. Imagine walking down a Roman street as a senator. Dozens of people greet you by name, and somehow you're supposed to remember them all. The solution? Bring a human memory. The nomenclator whispered reminders like, "That's Marcus from the forum. His wife's father loaned you money." Or, "Don't greet that guy. He voted against you." It was like having a living version of LinkedIn following you around. And since forgetting a name could ruin your reputation, nomenclators were surprisingly valuable. They were often well-educated slaves trained to recall hundreds of faces. Of course, they got no credit. No statue, no mention in marble inscriptions, just the satisfaction of knowing that every time their master looked smart, it was actually their whisper that did it. Some historians say this was the origin of the word nomenclature, because in Rome, even vocabulary had a slave behind it. Let's wander back toward the darker side of town, where the Ustrina, or cremation grounds, smoked constantly. Rome, for all its pomp, produced a lot of bodies. And someone had to manage the fire. The Ustriculi were professional corpse burners. They handled the cremations, cleaned the ashes, and made sure no jewelry accidentally disappeared into the fire. Not glamorous work, but necessary. They worked mostly at night, when the air was cooler and fewer passers-by complained about the smell. It was a mix of wood smoke, fat, and incense, a scent Rome politely ignored. When the body was burned, they'd gather the ashes, wash the bones, and place them carefully in urns. Then the family priest would arrive, say some prayers, and pay the Ustriculi in small coins or leftover wine. You can imagine them trudging home before dawn, soot on their faces, thinking, "Another emperor, another pile of bones. Maybe tomorrow I'll get a baker's son instead." The vomitorium attendants. Now, you've probably heard that Romans had vomitoriums, rooms for throwing up between courses. That's sort of a myth. The word vomitorium actually referred to the exit passages in amphitheaters, not literal puke rooms. But here's the twist. Some Romans did indeed vomit at banquets, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to keep eating. And who cleaned that up? That job fell to banquet attendants, often the youngest or lowest-ranking slaves. They stood quietly behind couches, ready with sponges, cloths, or a bucket when excess luxury caught up with the guests. The historian Suetonius even mentions that Emperor Claudius once vomited mid-banquet and just kept eating. Because when you're emperor, moderation is for peasants. So yes, technically, some people's job was to handle imperial indigestion. You can imagine their job description. Duties include serving wine, refilling dishes, and removing biological hazards from the carpet. The feather boys, servants of the banquet. Speaking of banquets, there was another equally peculiar position, the flabelliferi, or feather fan bearers. Their job, wave giant ostrich or peacock feathers over diners to keep them cool. It sounds relaxing, but it wasn't. Roman banquets could last 8 hours. If your arm got tired and the emperor started sweating, you might not have an arm the next morning. We know from mosaics and wall paintings that these attendants often stood silently behind couches, waving fans in perfect rhythm. Their motion had to be constant, slow, even, and dignified. You could almost call it an art form, if it weren't back-breaking labor. It's oddly comforting to think that while senators debated philosophy, there was always some poor teenager standing behind them, doing slow wrist circles with a fan.
The reminders of mortality, memento mori servants. Now, here's a job that really sums up Roman drama. During triumphal processions, when a victorious general rode through the city, a slave in his chariot and whispered, "Remember, you are mortal," or in Latin, memento mori. That was literally his job. All day, every few minutes, whispering the same phrase into a man's ear as the crowds screamed his name. Imagine being that guy. You're surrounded by cheering citizens, glittering armor, golden trophies, and your task is to softly ruin the vibe. But Romans believed it was necessary, a way to keep pride in check, to remind even the mightiest man that death came for all. It's kind of profound in a morbid way. Though you have to wonder if after the 500th whisper, the general started thinking, if I'm mortal, maybe I should throw you off this chariot first. Still, the role endured for centuries. A small, quiet voice in the middle of pomp. Proof that in Rome, even humility could be outsourced. The bird keepers of the circus. Back to something a bit less existential. The Circus Maximus, Rome's grand racetrack, wasn't just for horses. They released birds during races as omens or spectacles. And yes, there were people whose job was to catch and retrieve them afterward. Imagine sprinting through the stands trying to wrangle doves while thousands of spectators scream for their favorite chariot team. It sounds ridiculous, because it was. But the Romans took their symbolism seriously. If a bird flew in the wrong direction, priests might cancel the whole event. So the bird keepers had to train flocks to behave on cue. It's like an ancient version of a halftime show, with much more divine anxiety. The oil scrapers, stridulators. Every Roman bathhouse had a hierarchy. At the top, rich men soaking in luxury. At the bottom, the stridulators, attendants who scraped oil and sweat off bodies with curved metal tools called stridules. Because Roman bathing wasn't really about cleaning. It was more of an exfoliating social club. You'd smear yourself in olive oil, chat about politics, and then have some poor attendant scrape the mixture of dirt and oil off your skin into a bucket. Sometimes that oily residue was sold later as medicine or cosmetic cream. Yes, recycled human grease. Rome didn't waste anything. For the stridulator, the job required precision. Too soft, and the client complained. Too rough, and you might get slapped with a sandal. Some bathhouses employed dozens of them, the quiet backbone of Roman hygiene. The night watchman, Rome's human alarm system. Before police existed, Rome had vigiles, a sort of combination of firefighters, security guards, and night watchmen. They patrolled streets, stopped fights, and occasionally rescued drunks from falling into fountains. Their torches lit the city's alleys after dark, making them the only official workers awake at midnight
besides thieves and lovers. They also had to shout warnings if fires broke out, which they often did thanks to open lamps and too much wine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and in a city made of wood and ambition, the vigiles were the thin, smoky line between order and chaos. As the Roman night deepens, picture it again. The Colosseum empty and quiet, the perfume workshop still glowing faintly with oil lamps, a lonely nomenclator rehearsing names for tomorrow's Senate walk, and somewhere a slave whispering to a sleeping general, "You are mortal." Because in ancient Rome, every sound, every scent, and every shadow had a worker behind it. The empire didn't just run on power, it ran on the strangest jobs imaginable. The royal food tasters, dying so someone else could dine. Let's begin with dinner, because, of course, in Rome, even eating was political. When you're emperor, every mouthful could be your last. Poison was basically the office memo of choice in imperial politics. So naturally, someone had to taste the food first. That person was the praegustator, the imperial food taster. Their job was beautifully simple and utterly terrifying. Take a bite of every dish before the emperor did. If they survived, dinner continued. If they didn't, well, the chef probably didn't either. The praegustator stood silently beside the imperial couch, sampling meats, sauces, and wines, always keeping a straight face. They couldn't flinch, couldn't hesitate, because hesitation meant suspicion. And the irony? Sometimes emperors poisoned them first just to check if they were loyal. Claudius, famously paranoid, reportedly had multiple tasters. Nero, of course, alternated them frequently. He trusted no one. And Caligula? He was known to joke about poisoning his taster just to test the system. Classic Caligula. The position was so vital that tasters were considered part of the imperial court, with uniforms, pay, and privileges, but never peace of mind. Their tombstones, when they had them, often said things like, "He served faithfully and died in service," which sounds noble, but you have to remember that service probably meant swallowing experimental poison stew. The cupbearers, serving paranoia with wine. Closely related were the pochulators, or imperial cupbearers. They poured and served wine at banquets, ensuring it wasn't tainted. A single sip from the wrong goblet could end an emperor's reign faster than any rebellion. Cupbearers had to be graceful, quiet, and very observant, because if someone tampered with the cup, their life was also on the line. Many were young slaves chosen for beauty and discretion. They stood silently through endless dinners, refilling golden cups while senators plotted coups 3 seats away. Emperor Domitian was said to drink only wine poured by the same boy for years, trusting him more than his own generals. And honestly, given Roman politics, that was probably wise. Cupbearers were often richly dressed, silks, jewels, even perfume.
They were part servant, part status symbol, part potential corpse, and yet without them, no imperial feast could begin. The ornatrices, masters of imperial hair. Now, let's move from table to mirror. Roman women, especially the noble ones, treated hair as both art and warfare, and their hairdressers, the ornatrices, were soldiers on the front line. These women, often slaves, woke before dawn to curl, braid, oil, and sculpt elaborate hairstyles that could take hours. Some designs were so complex they required wireframes and beeswax. Others defied gravity through pure willpower and anxiety.
An ornatress wasn't just a stylist. She was a confidant, a therapist, and occasionally a victim, because Roman noblewomen were not known for their patience. There's a story about Empress Messalina, Claudius's wife, who once struck her ornatress across the face for pulling her hair too tight. Another about Julia Domna, who reportedly wept when her favorite stylist died, and then immediately replaced her with a younger one. Still, ornatresses held quiet power. They heard everything, they saw everyone, and they could destroy reputations with a single whisper while pretending to adjust a curl. If you ever wonder who truly ruled the empire, it might just have been the woman holding the comb. The imperial eunuchs, masters of the private realm. Let's talk about the eunuchs, because no Roman palace was complete without them. They were the gatekeepers of the emperor's most intimate world. The bedrooms, the treasury, the secret letters. Many were taken young from the eastern provinces, castrated, and trained in administration, etiquette, and absolute discretion. Because from Rome's twisted point of view, a man without heirs could be trusted. They served as chamberlains, wardrobe keepers, and sometimes even advisors. By the late empire, eunuchs were running half the bureaucracy, and emperors like Constantine or Theodosius relied on them completely. Some became so powerful that senators publicly mocked them, until, of course, they realized the eunuchs controlled access to the emperor's ear. In a way, they were the empire's living passwords. You couldn't reach power without passing through one. Their lives were lonely, disciplined, and full of irony. Stripped of one kind of manhood, they wielded a subtler kind of control. The imperial pet keepers. You might not think pet care was a Roman concept, but emperors loved their animals, often more than their families. And yes, there were professional custos animalium, animal keepers of the palace. These weren't just dogs and cats. We're talking exotic beasts, peacocks, panthers, even trained monkeys. Emperor Augustus kept a pet raven that could supposedly say Ave Caesar. And Caligula, unsurprisingly, had a horse named Incitatus that he treated like a senator, complete with servants, gold oats, and a marble stable. Imagine being the stable slave in charge of that, your entire career depending on the mood of a horse in an ivory stall. Good morning, sir. How's the consul feeling today? The custodians had to bathe, feed, and sometimes even entertain the emperor's animals. If a favorite pet died, it could spell disaster, not for the empire, but for the staff. So you can bet those creatures were pampered within an inch of their lives. The palace bird trainers. In addition to geese and chickens, the palace often had songbird trainers, responsible for teaching parrots and ravens to mimic imperial greetings. They'd repeat words hundreds of times, gently tapping the beak until it croaked out something vaguely Latin. It was considered an elite party trick. Imagine Nero showing off at dinner. Behold, my bird can insult senators. Probably not written by someone with job security. Still, the bird trainers had an odd kind of immunity. They were among the few who could speak freely, so long as they wrapped truth in humor. They were Rome's pressure valves, releasing a little steam before everything exploded. The whisperers, palace gossip brokers. Every great empire runs on gossip, and Rome industrialized it. Inside the palace lived dozens of whisperers, slaves whose sole task was to observe, listen, and pass information upward. They weren't spies in the dramatic sense. They were servants, letter carriers, bath attendants, doormen. They saw who entered whose room,
who cried after dinner, who didn't finish their wine, and they told the chamberlain, who told the eunuch, who told the emperor. By the time rumors reached the throne, they'd traveled through 5 layers of frightened whispering. No wonder paranoia was the empire's favorite hobby.
A clever servant could rise through manipulation, spreading just the right rumor at the right time. Many historians suspect some imperial purges began not with politics, but with palace gossip gone wrong. The silver polishers. Now let's step into the kitchens again, this time to meet the argentari, the silver polishers. Their world was one of endless gleam. They spent their days rubbing goblets, trays, and cutlery until their arms ached. Each piece of silver had to sparkle under candlelight, or they'd be whipped for dull service. They worked in silence, surrounded by smoke and clinking metal, breathing in fine silver dust that ruined their lungs. Their hands were raw, their clothes permanently gray. But at least they got to handle luxury, even if it was never theirs. It's strange to think that the emperor's face, reflected faintly in a polished dish, might have been glimpsed more often by a tired slave than any courtier. The readers and storytellers. Not every servant's life was grim. Some were purely intellectual, the lectors or readers. Their job was to read aloud to the emperor or his guests during meals and baths. They recited philosophy, history, or bad poetry, whatever the master preferred. If he fell asleep, that meant success. If he interrupted with corrections, well, you might want to fake a coughing fit and exit slowly. The Roman elite prided themselves on learning, but few wanted to actually read themselves. That's what educated slaves were for. Imagine sitting in a scented bath, listening to someone drone out Cicero while you sip wine. Honestly, not the worst job on this list. Monotonous, sure, but probably better than collecting pee. The musicians of the palace. Then there were the tibicines and citaristes, flute players and lyre musicians, who provided background music for dinners, baths, or even, well, more private moments. Some were virtuosos, imported from Greece or Egypt. Others were house slaves trained to play a single soothing melody for hours. Their music wasn't just entertainment, it was status. If you could afford a live soundtrack to your daily boredom, you'd truly made it. But there's something melancholy about it, too. A musician, playing in the corner of a marble hall, eyes down, repeating the same slow tune night after night, as senators gossip and cups clink. It's the sound of civilization, beautiful, exhausting, and a little sad. The human mirrors. Now, this one might sound metaphorical, but it wasn't. Some Roman nobles employed speculari, literally mirror slaves. These servants held polished metal mirrors so their masters could admire themselves while dressing. Their job required absolute stillness and flattery. If the reflection didn't please the client, the mirror holder got blamed. Imagine standing there, arms trembling, while a Roman matron complains that the lighting makes her look pale. You nod, smile, and agree that yes, her beauty is divine, and the mirror must be cursed. The Roman obsession with appearance ran deep. They even had slaves trained to comment positively during grooming, a constant drip of affirmation, ancient self-esteem management, outsourced. The bread sculptors. Let's end this section with something unexpectedly delightful, edible art. At lavish feasts, some bakers were tasked not with baking for hunger, but for aesthetics. They made panes figurati, sculpted bread shaped like animals, gods, or imperial portraits. The more absurd, the better. Imagine sitting at a banquet and being served a loaf shaped like your own head. That actually happened. Emperor Hadrian once joked that his likeness tasted surprisingly chewy. Bread sculptors worked in flour-covered silence, crafting masterpieces destined to be devoured within minutes. A perfect symbol of Roman luxury, intricate, fleeting, and a little insane. The palace quiets again. The last musician fades out, the candles gutter low, and somewhere in the corridors a whisperer writes down tomorrow's gossip. Behind every emperor's sigh, a servant breathes. Behind every glittering banquet, a dozen invisible hands polish, pour, scrape, and smile. Because Rome, for all its marble and grandeur, was built on labor so strange it almost sounds made up. Except it wasn't. It was just, well, human. The healers and street doctors. Medicine in Rome was half science, half theater. If you were rich, you called for a Greek-trained physician. If you were poor, you went to the street, to the medicus vicinalis, the neighborhood doctor who treated coughs with prayers and amputations with wine. They had no hospitals like ours. Instead, they worked in open stalls, wooden benches under awnings, filled with jars of herbs, sharp bronze tools, and the constant smell of vinegar. People came bleeding, coughing, limping. They left bandaged, sometimes healed, sometimes worse. One Roman medical manual lists over 600 remedies. Half of them involve honey, urine, or crushed insects. Snake bites, rub rooster fat. Fever, drink boiled olive leaves. Toothache, touch the tooth of a corpse. It sounds ridiculous, but it was all they had. And amid the chaos, some of them were brilliant. They knew how to set bones, suture wounds, and even perform cataract surgery with bronze needles. The street doctors lived hard lives, praised when they healed, blamed when they failed. Still, they kept the city alive, one bleeding ankle at a time. The fortune-tellers and dream interpreters. Walk a little further, and you'll find them sitting by the baths or the crossroads, the sortileghi, the fortune-tellers, old women with painted eyes, men with small wooden idols, whispering in low Latin mixed with Greek and charms from the East. Rome was obsessed with fate. Everyone, from senators to slaves, wanted to know what tomorrow held. Would the harvest fail? Would the mistress conceive? Would the emperor die? The fortune-tellers offered answers for a coin. They read dreams, bird flight, or lines in the palm. Some even claimed to read the pulse of the soul, touching your wrist and predicting your destiny. One chronicler described a famous seer who told a soldier he'd die under an old man's rule. The man laughed. Then, months later, was executed under the elderly Emperor Tiberius. Were they con artists? Maybe. But in a city where life could change overnight, hope was worth a few coins. The teachers and copyists. Rome loved knowledge almost as much as it loved conquest, and in its crowded tenements you could find humble grammatici, teachers of letters, shouting over the noise of the street. Picture a dusty room, 10 barefoot children scratching letters into wax tablets while the teacher paces with a stick. He's educated, maybe even brilliant, but poor, paid in bread, olives, or old clothes. Some teachers doubled as copyists, writing letters or copying scrolls for merchants and magistrates, their hands cramped, their eyes strained by oil lamps, their backs bent. Yet without them, no philosophy, no poetry, no law would have survived. The empire wrote on papyrus, but its memory was human. Every scroll you've ever seen in a museum began in some dark Roman room where a tired man whispered words he'd never own.
And yet, the story isn't over, because behind all of this, there's one more world waiting. Darker, stranger, and even more human. The underworld of slaves, gladiators, and outcasts. That's where we'll go next, into the arenas, prisons, and secret temples where Rome's forgotten souls lived, fought, and dreamed of freedom. It's late. Rome has gone quiet. The last torches flicker along the forum, the wine stalls are shuttered, and even the street dogs have curled up in the alleys. But somewhere far off, past the marble villas and the bathhouse steam, you hear something. The faint rhythm of iron chains, the hiss of torches against stone, the slow breathing of men who have spent too long underground. Welcome to the other Rome, the one that built everything, fought for everything, and received almost nothing. The slave that built an empire. If you lived in ancient Rome and you weren't rich, there was a good chance you were someone's property. Slavery wasn't a dark corner of the empire. It was the foundation. It built the roads, the temples, the aqueducts, and the stories we still tell. Historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of Rome's population were slaves. Imagine that. Every third face on the street. They came from everywhere. Gaul, Greece, Egypt, Britain, Syria, Nubia, captured in wars, sold by pirates, or born into servitude in the belly of the city. A slave might be a miner in Spain, coughing black dust until he forgot what the sun looked like, or a tutor in a senator's house, educated, fluent in Greek, and still considered less than a dog. Rome was pragmatic about cruelty. If something needed doing, they'd find someone to do it. And if that person broke, they'd find another. But it wasn't always the same story. Some slaves became wealthy. A clever accountant or physician could earn his freedom and end up richer than his former master. Others never saw daylight again. Freedom was possible, but not promised. And even when a slave became free, they carried the scars of ownership forever. The life below ground. The mines. Let's float for a moment, far from the city, into the mines of Hispania in Sardinia, where Rome dug its wealth out of the earth. The air is thick and metallic. Torches flicker against damp rock. Down here, men work naked except for rags, their bodies coated in dust and sweat. They are slaves, prisoners, or condemned debtors. They dig silver, copper, salt, and iron. Their tools are crude. Their food is moldy. Their sleep is short. Pliny the Elder once wrote that miners perish as fast as they work, and he wasn't being poetic. Some mines were so deep that the air itself was poison, a slow, invisible killer. To Rome, this was acceptable. After all, there were always more slaves. Occasionally a mine would collapse. The news might travel to the city, but no one cared. The empire measured wealth in ingots, not in lives. And yet, even in that darkness, there were songs. We know this from ancient graffiti, carved into the tunnel walls. Simple words, names, prayers, little poems of exhaustion and defiance. It's strange, isn't it? Even in the worst corners of history, people still left marks that said, "I was here."
The house slaves and the masks of service. Back in the city, slavery wore different faces. A domestic slave might live in a fine home, dressed neatly, hair combed, face expressionless. They were the invisible machinery of Roman luxury. Cooks, body servants, cleaners, hairdressers, secretaries, readers, even comedians kept for the amusement of guests. They learned to anticipate moods, to step softly, to flatter without being obvious. A good servant was prized, but never safe. One wrong word, one broken dish, one unlucky day, and punishment could be brutal. Roman law allowed masters to execute slaves for disobedience. It wasn't frequent, but the fear was constant. And yet, some masters freed them out of affection or guilt. Freedmen could start businesses, marry, and even become wealthy. Still, they bore a reminder of their past, the cap of liberty they wore after manumission, shaped like a small felt cone. Freedom had a uniform too. The gladiators awakening. Now imagine dawn breaking over the Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school. The sun touches the barracks first, long rows of stone, iron-barred windows, and the smell of oil, sweat, and metal. Inside, hundreds of men are waking up. They are the empire's strangest paradox, both slaves and celebrities. Gladiators were property, yes, bought, trained, and branded, but they were also adored, cheered by thousands, worshipped by women, and feared by the elite. A successful fighter could earn fame, fortune, and maybe freedom. But most died young, their names fading before the crowd's roar even died out. Training was brutal. Wooden swords first, then real ones. Endless drills in sand, sparring, running, shouting. Their diet was mostly barley and beans, heavy to keep their muscles thick. They were nicknamed hortieri, the barley men. Instructors, called doctores, trained them in different styles. The heavily armed mirmillo, with a big shield and fish-shaped helmet. The nimble retiarius fighting with net and trident. The secutor, with a smooth helmet built just to face that net thrower. Every match was theater, carefully matched types, weapons, and styles. Fighting to entertain, but not always to kill. Most people imagine gladiators fighting to the death every time. In truth, that was expensive. A dead gladiator couldn't earn more money for his owner. So most fights ended with injury, surrender, or mercy, decided by the editor of the games, who could grant missio, release, or demand death. Still, the sand always turned red.
The fans and the fame. Roman crowds loved their favorites, like modern fans love pop stars. They painted slogans on walls. Silatus makes the girls sigh. Crescens is the delight of all maidens. Women sent love letters, hairlocks, even money. A few gladiators became mistresses of noblewomen, dangerous liaisons that could end in execution. One story tells of a senator's wife who fell for a gladiator named Eros. She disguised herself to visit him in the barracks. When her husband found out, both were killed. Rome enjoyed that sort of irony. But for all the adoration, gladiators lived like prisoners. They slept in locked cells, were beaten for defiance, and often branded on the face with SPQR, property of Rome. Freedom could come through victory or through buying it with their winnings. When it did, they received a wooden sword called the rudis, symbolizing release. Many still stayed. After all, the arena was the only place they were ever respected. A day in the amphitheater. Let's wander up into the stands for a moment.
You can smell the iron, the wine, the blood and dust mixing in the heat. The crowd hums. Senators in white togas, merchants in stained tunics, women with veils and jewels. Vendors shout, selling dates, sausages, and honey cakes. The games begin with processions, trumpets, banners, the fighters parading past statues of gods. Then mock hunts, exotic animals, lions, leopards, bears, even elephants. After that, the real fights. Swords clash, sand flies, and every few minutes a voice from the crowd screams, "Yugala! Kill him!" Sometimes the loser kneels, sometimes the victor looks to the editor, waiting for the thumb signal. It's not clear what that gesture really was. Maybe thumbs up, maybe down, maybe turned sideways. Historians argue. The crowd never did. And then the decision comes. Mercy or death. The crowd roars either way. When it's over, slaves rake the sand smooth again. The blood disappears, and the next match begins. Rome loved to erase and repeat. The dead and the forgotten. When a gladiator died, his body didn't go to a noble tomb. It went to the libetinarii, the undertakers who specialized in disposing of the poor and the disgraced. They stripped the armor, washed the wounds, and buried the bodies outside the city walls, often with simple inscriptions. Felix, who fought 12 times, he rests. No age, no family, just statistics. Yet sometimes the fans remembered. They placed flowers on graves, built small shrines, even left oil lamps burning. In death, these fighters became saints of spectacle, symbols of courage and futility. The slave revolts and the fear of Rome. Rome feared its slaves more than any foreign army, because they outnumbered their masters, and every villa, every mine, every household was a potential spark. The most famous fire was Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator who led a massive rebellion in 73 BCE. He and his followers, mostly escaped slaves, defeated several Roman legions, burning estates and freeing captives. For 2 years they terrorized the Italian countryside. The Senate panicked. They sent general after general until Crassus, the richest man in Rome, crushed them. 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. It was Rome's favorite warning: obedience or death. But even after that, slave uprisings never really stopped. There were smaller revolts in Sicily, Asia, Gaul. Each time crushed, each time remembered. And though Spartacus lost, his name survived, the only slaves whose shadow stretched longer than any emperor's. The cults of the forgotten. Now, let's step into something stranger: the secret religions that grew in Rome's cracks. Officially, everyone worshipped Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and the emperor. But slaves and foreigners found comfort in different gods, ones who actually listened. In dim basements and candlelit caves they gathered. They sang hymns in languages half the city couldn't understand. They invoked Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Phrygia. Mithras especially became popular among soldiers and gladiators. His cult met underground around frescoes of him slaying a sacred bull, a symbol of courage and rebirth. Members shared a ritual meal of bread and wine, swore oaths, and treated each other as equals, a radical idea in a world built on hierarchy. To Rome's elites, this was suspicious, even dangerous. Anything secret was subversive. But to those who'd lost everything, these cults offered belonging, a kind of invisible freedom. The small mercies. Of course, not every story ends in cruelty. Some masters freed their slaves and treated them like family. Some gladiators retired and opened taverns. Some miners escaped, somehow, and disappeared into the countryside. Rome was vast, and in its vastness, mercy could hide. We have letters from freedmen thanking their patrons, inscriptions of wives dedicating tombs to husbands they once served, and prayers from soldiers who had once been slaves, thanking the gods not for victory, but for peace. Those tiny notes of gratitude ring louder now than all the marching drums. Night in the Subura. As the night deepens again, we return to the Subura, the poorest district of Rome. Smoke drifts from cooking fires. Children sleep on rooftops. Somewhere, a flute plays, soft, wandering, lonely. In a small courtyard, a freed woman lights an oil lamp and whispers a prayer to her household gods. Next door, a gladiator drinks cheap wine and laughs with the baker's daughter. Across the street, a lamplighter finishes his last wick, sighs, and looks at the stars. Rome hums quietly, as if exhausted by its own glory. And down below, in the shadowed tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima, water still flows, steady, ancient, indifferent. Rome liked to think of itself as eternal, but the people who lived it knew better. They came and went, worked and suffered, prayed and sang, and left behind only names carved in stone, tools rusted in earth, and fragments of stories like this one.
So tonight, if you close your eyes and imagine the Eternal City, don't see the emperors or the marble or the triumphs. See the hands that built it, the sweat that fed it, the hearts that beat quietly beneath its noise. They were Rome too, and they deserve to be remembered, softly, slowly, as the night carries them home. Hey there again. If you've somehow drifted through all 5 parts without falling asleep yet, congratulations! You've officially survived the public toilets, the gladiator sweat, the professional mourners, and even the holy geese. So tonight, as the oil lamps flicker low, let's float upward, away from the crowded streets, into the polished marble halls of the imperial palace. Because if you thought the working class in Rome had weird jobs, wait till you meet the people in charge. When power went to the head, literally. Let's start with Caligula, the man who thought being emperor meant being a god, a stand-up comedian, and possibly a horse enthusiast, all at once. Born as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, Caligula got his nickname as a child. It means little boots. Cute, right? The nickname stuck, and the cuteness did not. Caligula grew up surrounded by murder, paranoia, and the general chaos of early imperial Rome. By the time he took the throne, his nerves were about as stable as a wooden chariot on cobblestone. And like any deeply unwell man with too much money and absolute power, he decided to get creative. He made senators run beside his chariot like pet dogs, built floating palaces across lakes, and, of course, tried to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul. The horse had a marble stable, purple blankets, and servants whose entire job was to feed it gold-flaked goats. Rome had gone from bread and circuses to horses and hysterics. It's easy to laugh, and historians often do, but Caligula's reign wasn't all jokes. Behind the bizarre behavior was a man possibly suffering from severe mental illness after years of trauma and isolation. But Rome didn't have therapy, it had daggers. And after just 4 years, his guards stabbed him to death in a palace corridor, probably during one of his divine dinners. Claudius, the accidental emperor. After Caligula's blood hit the marble, the imperial palace needed a new ruler. Who better than the stuttering, limping uncle everyone thought was harmless? Enter Emperor Claudius, the man nobody took seriously until it was too late. Claudius spent most of his life being laughed at by his own family. He drooled, twitched, and hid behind scrolls while the rest of the Julio-Claudians were busy murdering each other. When the guards found him hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination, they basically said, he'll do, and made him emperor. Which somehow worked. Claudius turned out to be
competent. He expanded the empire, reformed the bureaucracy, and spent his free time writing nerdy books about Etruscan history. But, of course, this is Rome, so it couldn't last. He married Agrippina the Younger, a woman with the charm of a cobra and the patience of a chess player. She wanted power for her son, Nero. So, when Claudius inconveniently refused to die on schedule, Agrippina helped. According to gossip, she poisoned his favorite mushrooms. Claudius ate dinner, went to bed, and didn't wake up. Rome, as usual, applauded politely and moved on. And now, Nero, the emperor who fiddled, sort of. Ah, Nero. The name alone hums with disaster. He's the poster child for imperial chaos. The emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Except, small correction, fiddles didn't exist yet. He probably played the lyre, so technically he liared while Rome burned, which somehow sounds even worse. Nero started his reign young and promising. He gave concerts, built theaters, and even abolished some cruel taxes. But then came the paranoia, the ego, and the mother issues. He had his mother, Agrippina, remember her? Murdered in one of history's most awkward family reunions. First, he tried to sink her boat. She swam back to shore. So he sent soldiers instead. Problem solved, apparently. Later, when the Great Fire of Rome swept through the city in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had ordered it himself so he could rebuild the city in his own image. His new palace, Domus Aurera, or Golden House, covered acres, complete with rotating dining rooms and artificial lakes. Meanwhile, thousands of citizens were homeless. So Nero blamed the Christians. And that did not age well. Eventually, even the Senate had enough. When they declared him a public enemy, Nero fled the city, muttering, "What an artist dies in me." And then he did. Alone. In a villa, ending the bloodline of Julius Caesar and closing Rome's first dynasty with one last dramatic whisper. Let's drift to the next madness. Commodus, the gladiator emperor. Now we glide a century forward. The empire is still enormous, still decadent, and still deeply weird. Enter Commodus, the emperor who thought he was Hercules. Literally. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher king who wrote Meditations, a manual for inner peace and discipline. His son apparently didn't read it. Commodus liked fighting gladiators, posing in lion skins, and making statues of himself holding clubs. He'd strut into the Colosseum, kill a few wounded animals, then accept applause from terrified senators. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodana, basically Commodus City. He even renamed the months after himself. Yes, January became Commodus Prime. Eventually, the empire's patience ran out. One of his concubines poisoned his wine, and when that didn't work fast enough, his wrestling partner strangled him in the bath. A fitting end for a man who never stopped to pretend. The bureaucrats, the eunuchs, and the forgotten workers of empire. While emperors were busy melting down into chaos, a whole class of quiet workers kept the machinery of empire running. The scribes, the accountants, the palace eunuchs, they rarely make it into the grand stories, but they were the backbone of imperial life. Imagine spending decades tracking taxes for a man who believed his horse could talk, or organizing dinner parties where the main entertainment was watching senators pretend to laugh at imperial jokes. The palace bureaucracy was an endless river of scrolls, stamps, and side-eye. And let's not forget the eunuchs, who held surprising power. Because they couldn't produce heirs, they were considered safe servants, loyal, neutral, and discreet. Many rose to manage finances, handle imperial correspondence, or even command armies. So yes, while emperors lost their heads, these quiet, cautious men kept Rome from falling apart, at least for a while. The quiet collapse. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was tired. Too many palaces, too many assassinations, too many taxes. The city that once fed on conquest began feeding on itself. Jobs like public urine collector or street crier faded away as trade slowed and cities shrank. Temples fell silent. The sacred geese stopped honking. And the marble statues, once gleaming, began to crumble, not from war, but from time. Even emperors began to blend together, one bearded face after another, ruling for a year or two before being replaced. It's as if the whole empire decided to hit autopilot while quietly dozing off. And maybe that's how it was meant to go. Slowly. Gently. Like an overworked storyteller finally closing the scroll. So, what's the lesson here? Maybe that every civilization, no matter how powerful, eventually gets weird jobs, mad leaders, and sleepy citizens who just want their bread ration on time. Or maybe that humanity never changes. We just trade our togas for suits, our amphitheaters for office cubicles, our emperors for CEOs. Either way, Rome had a job for everyone. From the guy scraping urine jars to the woman pretending to cry at funerals. From the geese guarding temples to the emperor playing God with his horse. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was human. And now, as the torchlight fades over the Tiber River, we can let the city rest. The workers, the mourners, the emperors, all asleep under the same quiet sky. So, close your eyes, because even in ancient Rome, eventually, everyone went home. And so should you. Good night, traveler.